guess we can't put this off any further. To tell you the truth, I don't want to be here either, if that's any comfort. And I know how it must look. I've been to enough writing programs in my time, and you sit there and think, 6 hours of legal writing, my God. That's the bad news. The worst news is we evidently have the last doc matrix document camera left on the planet, so it's going to be hard to read my materials. So this is a headache just waiting to happen. The good news is, well, here's some more bad news. We're going to be talking a lot about grammar today, and I know how daunting that topic is. The good news is, I'm pretty sure I'm the most entertaining grammarian you've ever heard. However, this is a lot like being the best deep sea fisherman in Omaha. You know, I mean, there isn't a lot of competition for this particular job. My name is Ron Hofer. Let me give you a little of my background and then give you an overview of what we're doing today. I originally wanted to be an English professor, and so I was an English major in undergrad, and I spent 4 years trying to get a PhD in linguistics and literature at the University of Virginia about 45 years ago. I never got my PhD, but I never got meningitis either, so I figure it's kind of a wash. After law school, or after leaving grad school, I taught freshman comp and some American Lit courses back home in Wisconsin at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and at Marquette University. And because I just wasn't there, or because my wife wasn't that fond of living in the kind of Appalachian squalor that we would have to on my salary alone, she put a gun to my head and sent me off packing to Marquette's law school. And most of my paying legal career was as a staff attorney for the Court of Appeals back in Wisconsin. So my job was to read lawyers' briefs and pro se briefs and evaluate them and draft opinions. I also started teaching legal writing courses at Marquette's Law School in '88, and I taught a variety of those courses and a variety of courses on appellate law for over 20 years. And then in '94, I started teaching at the National Judicial College out in Reno. And I've been teaching there ever since. And for the last 10 years, I speak almost exclusively to judges. So I have to kind of adapt when I'm dealing with lawyers. For one thing, today, I won't have to talk so damn slow. You know, just. In any event, my approach to writing, it really draws on my various experiences. And I want to talk to you for a minute about teaching freshman comp. Now, this was almost 43 years ago. Now, I'll let you in on a secret. Freshman comp is every bit as unpleasant to teach as it is to take. All right, there's not a soul who wants to be there. And my students' essays were between god-awful and abysmal. And about every third sentence, and I can only imagine what it's like to try and teach freshman comp today. It was tough enough 40 years ago, my head would explode. About every third sentence that my students wrote were just phosphorescently bad. And as we will figure out today, all of you are every bit as good a judge of bad writing as anybody else is. I guess I'm an expert on this, and of course an expert is a guy from at least 3 states over, so I'm from Wisconsin, so I guess I qualify. In any case, I just come off of 4 years working on a PhD in English and linguistics. And when I was grading my students' papers, I could recognize these sentences as being awful. But to be honest with you, unless the problem was extremely basic, I knew that the sentence was bad, but I didn't know exactly why it was bad. And so what I did at first, and I think a lot of English teachers do this, is when I saw a bad sentence that I didn't want to get into particulars about, I would just put an abbreviation in the margin. And that abbreviation was AWK for awkward. This student is an awkward sentence. And I thought about getting a rubber stamp so I could save myself a little elbow grease. And finally, after a semester of doing this, the light bulb went on in my head. And I realized I'm not doing these kids any good. Because if you think about it, when your English teacher writes awkward on your essay, the message is, I don't like this sentence, but I'm not telling you why. And the problem lay with me. I didn't exactly know why, despite all of this background in the language. So I determined that I wasn't going to use awkward anymore. Now, one of the other textbooks for this course was a grammar handbook, and I urge you all to find your grammar handbook from high school or college, or go over to the used bookstore and buy one. You don't have to buy the newest English grammar handbook, because grammar changes at something like a glacial pace. So last year's grammar book is every bit as good as this year's grammar book. If you get more than about 15 or 20 years old, what they won't have is coverage of gender-neutral language, but that's about the only change that's come about. So I would take the grammar handbook, and I resolved that every time I saw a lousy sentence, I would diagnose it via the grammar handbook. And at first, it took me forever to grade papers, because at first, I'm just leafing through the damn book, looking for an ugly example that matches the kind of ugliness on my students' writing. And it took forever. And I was teaching 3 sections of freshman comp with 25 students apiece, and each of them had to write an essay a week of 2 to 3 pages. So every weekend I was grading 75 papers. Frankly, this is why I drink. It was enough to get the bourbon bottle right there and hope that you got your paper graded at the beginning rather than the end. Well, here's what happened. By the end of the school year, it didn't take me so long to find the problems. And after a time, I didn't need the grammar handbook anymore. I mean, I had really internalized all of the things that we can do to screw up a sentence. And there aren't that many of them. And that's the point of today. My notion of good legal writing, or good judicial writing, because they're the same kind of writing, good legal writing is the absence of bad legal writing. And what I'm going to try to do with you today is to give you some skills. First of all, to sharpen up some skills you already have, to teach you a couple of new skills, and most importantly, give you a new way to edit your work. Because I've got a hunch, and it's a hunch I would even lay money on, that I know how you currently edit your work. And here's how it goes. Type, 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 type. Find the print button. Press it. March over to the printer. wait for it to print out, start reading it on the way back to your office, get back to your desk, finish reading it, put it down, and go, another job well done. Well, the fact of the matter is that's how most of us, we are too busy and we have deadlines, etc. That's how most of us write. That's also the worst time and the worst way to edit your own work. And let me see if I can prove this. Raise your hand if you ever had to reread something that you yourself wrote more than 6 months back. All right, did you ever have to reread? Keep your hand in the air if you liked what you read 6 months later. And most hands go down. And the reason is that in the intervening 6 months or 6 years, you've forgotten what the voice in your head told you to write way back when. And what that means is when you go back and read your own work at a later date, if you've forgotten what that voice is, and most of us have, you are now reading your own prose from the perspective of the poor slob who had to read it when you first ventured it out into the world. So what I'm going to give you today is a tool that will help you edit your own work without relying upon the sounds of your own luscious prose. And frankly, this stuff will help. More importantly than giving you this tool and refreshing you on some stuff about how language operates, frankly, one of my real goals, and this is true at the college as well, I hope you walk out of here this afternoon. Well, first of all, I hope that by 4:30 this afternoon, there will have been no projectile vomiting. I set the level at kind of that, and I figure if I can accomplish that. I hope that everybody leaves today a little bit more energized about how language works and the marvelousness of it all. Now, I've been to a lot of legal and judicial writing courses, and many of them are just kind of cheerleading. And what I've done, of course, you can't read it because this is the world's worst projector, so I'm going to have to read these for you. What this is the table of contents to Strunk and White's Elements of Style, a book that, they press into your palm the day that you start law school. And a lot of people who teach writing just kind of rely on the statements from Strunk and White. And I'm not saying they're bad statements, but I am saying that they're of a limited utility. In matters of style, write in a way that comes naturally. Now, is there any of you to whom that's news? I mean, have any of you been laboring under the notion that, you know what, the best thing for my reader is an unnatural style? And I can go through all of this. Do not overwrite, do not overstate, be clear. Nobody hears that and goes, now I see the light. The fact is, these are all great goals, but just standing up here and say, let's all cheer for clarity doesn't do anything. So I really want this to be a focus on skills, and it means we're going to have to talk about grammar. And you'll be surprised at how much you remember correctly from when you were a little person and learned all this stuff in the first place. But before I get into this seriously, I want to make a couple of points. The first is about the nature of language itself. If you've ever given any thought to why do we have language, the easiest conclusion to arrive at is that, well, we have language so that we can communicate. And what language does is give us common symbols, that is words, so that when I talk about that screen, everybody in the room knows that it's that object here that I'm talking about. Essentially, that language gives us a way to label reality so as to be able to talk about reality. That is, it's a kind of mirror of reality. I want to suggest that language is more powerful than that. That language can actually help create the reality for your reader or listener. And I'm going to try and prove this with an experiment that was conducted about 40 years ago by a sociology professor. And he tried this experiment on thousands of students over, I don't know, 10 or 15 years. And what he would do is for every incoming class of Soc 101, he would show the class an 8-second videotape. No sound, silent movie. And all it was a videotape of one car T-boning another car, all right? So everybody in the room experienced the same reality, which is just seeing a silent movie of that car accident. What the professor then did was to break his students into 3 groups. And each of the groups had to answer a different question about what they saw. And the first group was asked this question: at what speed was the car going when it contacted the other car? The second group had to answer, at what speed was the car going when it hit the other car? And the last question, at what speed was the car going when it smashed into the other car? Now remember, everybody, all the students experienced the same reality. However, if you were in the first group, your average speed was 32 miles per hour. If you're in the second group, it was 34 miles per hour. And if you're in the third group, it was 41 miles per hour. So language is more than just describing what we've got. It can condition your reader into accepting a point of view. And that's the kind of language we'll be talking about all day today. Okay, a couple more points about all of us as readers. Because remember, the most important thing is to write so that your audience gets the point you're trying to make. And if your audience doesn't get that point, that's your problem and not the reader's problem. And this is particularly true when you're writing to a court. If the judge doesn't get the message you intended, it's your fault, even if the judge has an IQ below freezing, which has occurred. It's still the writer's responsibility to get the point across. So let me talk, first of all, about some things that are true for all of us. Now, this next thing, I know you won't be able to read, but I hope you'll be able to recognize what's going on the screen. This is a page from a published appellate case from the state of Wisconsin. I know you can't read it, but you can probably still detect that almost the entire page is one big block quote, right? We've all seen this page. Now, what's said in Omaha stays in Omaha. Be brutally honest. When, let's say you're reading the other side's brief and you come across this page in the argument section of opposing counsel's brief, what do you really do? We have a winner. Hold your calls. Yeah. Nobody reads this page. What we do, as the gentleman suggests, you read the first sentence and go, this is going to be way the hell too much work. And then we drop down to here where the prose starts up again, and we hope, usually against hope, that this is going to explain all the crap that I really don't want to have to read. Okay, now, here's the first writing tip of the day. If any page in your brief looks like this, guess what? The court ain't going to read it. Nobody wants to get faced with something this daunting. So, when you're quoting an authority, there's almost no reason for a quote as huge as that middle one. Leave the parts out of the quote that don't pertain to this case. Shorten those quotes as much as you can. Let's say it's a very complicated statute. Leave the parts out that don't apply to this case. And there are going to be parts that don't apply here because statutes are full of conditions. And a bunch of these conditions won't be applicable here. If you have to give your reader a big quote, highlight that phrase or clause by using, emphasis or italics. At least then the reader's eye is drawn to something that a reader is likely to read. Okay, let's say you're also reading this brief and you turn the page, and this is the next sentence in this brief. And I'll give you a minute to chew on it. It turns out, if you guys are having a lot of trouble, this is easier to read from the back of the room than close up. So, but if you can manage it, you're okay. This is from a published case. Now, first of all, is there any among you who, having read this, would now proudly stand up and take authorial credit for having written it? All right? My point is, bad writing is bad writing to everyone. And that's pretty much true with good writing as well. Now, all right, you've had time to chew on this sentence. Once you have finished reading all the words in the sentence, what are your choices? Does anybody finish that sentence and go, oh, give me more? Right? I can't wait to see what happens next. No, I mean, this challenges our head. You look at this sentence and you say, now I know what a headache looks like. So, if you are the intended audience here for this sentence, what are your choices after you get here for the first time? What can you do? You can soldier on, all right, and figure, well, let's hope the next sentence is clearer. And what are the odds of that? Or you can go back and reread it. But in rereading it, you're not happy. Why? Because I don't want to read this in the first place. I'll tell you a story that I think has it's a funny story, and I think has a pretty important lesson. The very first course that I taught in Reno for judges was a course for new appellate judges. And the judges had to submit writing samples. They had to send in opinions, and I asked for short opinions. And I would evaluate them, we'd throw them up on the document camera and talk about them in class. And one of them struck me as remarkable for a couple of reasons. The first was that in this is about 15-page opinion. The reader is never told who wins the case until the last paragraph. This is a bad idea. But weirder than that, as I was reading this the first time, I could have sworn that the author was dropping hints that this case was going to go in the other direction. And so I get to the last paragraph, and it's like, whoa, where did this come from? Well, I wanted to talk about this in class, so I said, Judge, I read your opinion. A couple of things. Number one, you didn't tell the reader who wins the case until the last paragraph. And he smiles at me, yes, I know that. And I said, and maybe I'm the village idiot, but man, I thought that the case was going to go the other way. And now he is grinning like the Cheshire Cat. He could not be more pleased. This is exactly the effect he was shooting for. And I'm baffled. And I thought to myself, why? But, judges can be kind of prickly. So I thought I'd better phrase this in a way that was respectful. So I said to him, why? And he looked at me, I swear to God, his exact words. Would a mystery writer tell you the murderer on page 1? And I thought to myself, I am rendered without speech. I don't know what to say. But here's what I told him, and this is wise for lawyers and judges alike. I said, Judge, I have great confidence in what I am about to say. I believe this to be empirically true. I said, nobody takes a stack of your opinions home, lights the fire, puts on the comfy slippers, calls in the dog, pours a snifter of brandy, sits down in the comfy chair, the one with the ottoman, and goes, hot damn, I can't wait. The fact of the matter, ladies and gentlemen, is no one reads judicial opinions because they want to. It's because they have to. The same is true for you. Your readership is an unwilling readership. Nobody would read your briefs unless they got paid to read them. Nobody, collects your work product and figures, man, what a great thing for a snowy afternoon, okay? So remember that your audience is already kind of pissy when they start. And what this means is you want to make your audience's trip through this document as painless as you can, because it will benefit you. I can tell you from having dealt, I probably drafted, 2,000 opinions when I worked for the court. I want to tell you, if one side's brief was the maximum 45 pages and the other side's brief was 5 pages, before I even picked up the briefs to win, I know whose side I'm on. All right? This is just human nature. Okay. Now, the easiest thing for us as legal writers to do is to forget about your readership. So now you know whoever is reading your document doesn't want to read it. You should also realize that when you write, and I'm going to work in the realm of appellate briefs because that was my bad. When you write appellate briefs, the minute you finish writing that brief, you are the world's expert on this topic, okay? And when the appellate judge who ends up with that reads it, you are really educating the judge about what this case is all about. And the most common mistake I saw in almost 30 years of working for the court was that the drafter forgot that the reader doesn't know anything yet, that the drafter starts on square 15 instead of square 1. I don't know if this is going to come across. This is from a real appellate brief that we got a long time ago. I'm not sure that you'll be able to read this, but I'll read it for you if you can. Here's a statement of argument. The state did not fail to provide evidence of an act of so-and-so in furtherance of the conspiracy, so that the circuit court did not err in its refusal to vacate so-and-so's judgment of conviction for conspiracy on the ground of such claimed but non-existent failure. I mean, there's like 15 negatives in this one sentence. That's not designed, and for that matter, this sentence that we've already looked at, oops. This was the creation of a judicial writer, but it's not designed for a human being to read it. And so the particular audience we're going to talk about today, most commonly, is that human, that carbon-based life form who, for whatever reason, has your document in front of her or him at any particular moment. To give you another example of how easy it is to forget your audience. You've all seen one of these. I borrowed this one from the United People. He said anything, so I thought, you've all seen one of these, right? Okay. Now, even from a distance, you can see that at least 4/6 of this card is virtually all pictorial. Now, if this is all pictures and no words, essentially, what can we infer about the readership? Who's included in the readership that wouldn't be included if it was all done in text? Speak up. Children? Anybody who can't read English, all right? And actually, the next time you're really bored on an airplane, and I mean even more bored than you are at 9:30, pull out this card and see if you can follow it. This one is pretty good. My only objection to the people who are pictured on this card is that everyone is smiling. I don't think so. You know, if I'm fastening my mask, and I fly around a lot, so I hear all of the latest funnies. And, you know, Southwest lets the flight attendants give a spiel of their own making. And part of the one that I heard recently was, if you're traveling with a small child, please secure the child's mask before you, after you secure your own. If you are traveling with more than one child, pick your favorite. Okay, so here's my point. Whoever wrote this knew that his or her audience included people who can't read English. And there is one panel that's got language on it, but much of it up here is just translations into foreign languages. But let me read you one sentence, the one sentence that's in English at the top. And I put it up here, but you wouldn't be able to see it. If you are sitting in an exit row, please identify yourself to a crew member to allow for reseating if you lack the ability to read. What am I missing here, you know? My point is, it is so easy to forget who your reader is. And it's the reader that you've got to keep happy. I found this on the interwebs, and looks like a real billboard. Illiterate, write for free help. No problem, as soon as I learn how to write. Okay, one other thing about literate adults, as all of you are, and that is you don't have sufficient faith in your own powers of knowing how language works. I learned this when I was teaching English 40-some years ago. If I would meet somebody at a cocktail party, you know, somebody I didn't know, and you're chatting, and somebody says, what do you do for a living? And I would say, I'm an English teacher. They would need to go someplace else really quickly. And it finally dawned on me, it wasn't my cologne, it was, at some point they expect an English teacher to say, so how about those dangling participles, eh? The fact is, all of you know more about language than you give yourself credit for. And this is part of the message for the rest of today, is we're going to re-examine all the stuff you sort of know about language, and we're going to nail it down so that you can be sure about it. But to show you that you do, we're going to do an exercise, which I think you can still read. This would look familiar to any of you who have either taken or taught English as a second language. If English is your native tongue, the one you learned from your mother's knee, there's no problem here. If you learned English later on, especially as an adult, there's a skill involved that a native speaker doesn't have to worry about. So just to make sure that everybody's blood is moving at 20 to 10 on Wednesday, December 21st, at the count of 3, please read the sentence at the bottom out loud with the blanks properly filled in. Okay, 1, 2, 3. I've heard a lot about Nebraska lawyers, but man, I didn't believe some of the legend until now. There were 12 big red apples, okay? Now, somebody tell me something about what you were given and what you did with it. What's the difference between what you were given and your result? The order, exactly. Everybody in this room reordered those elements in exactly the same way, despite the fact that nobody in this room has ever given a moment's thought to the truth, and it is a truth, that when you got a bunch of adjectives piled up in front of a noun, that number comes before size comes before color. If you think of any nursery rhyme, it'll fit that paradigm. So my point is, all of you know more about English than you give yourself credit for. And here's how I'm going to make you use it. First of all, imagine what you think it must have been like to be in a 3rd grade Catholic school class in 1961, because that's where I was. And in 1961, the good sisters of Notre Dame would ask us, the class, a communal question to which we were expected to respond in unison. And the good sister would preface this by saying, class, not in quite that low a voice, but class, and people would respond. And I'm going to ask you to do that for the bulk of what we're doing today, because I'm going to ask you questions about grammar and syntax that I know you haven't thought about in 5 or 10 or 20 or 40 years. But it doesn't matter. Your instincts about this will get you to the right answer virtually every time. Now, in 1961, the School Sisters of Notre Dame had a novel but effective means of enforcing the rule that everybody speak up. And this means was a little something they called a yardstick. Now, I'm not going to insult all of you by threatening you with a yardstick. I'm going to use a laser pointer. And if you don't play the game, I will have to inflict retinal damage. I don't want to hurt anyone, so don't make me, okay? Okay. Now, here's the drill. I'm going to have you do a very brief writing drafting exercise, and we're going to talk about the results for bloody ever. And we're going to work through, this is really, today is about sentence structure. And going back to my definition of good writing being the absence of bad writing, I am of a mind that if you can write one good sentence and follow it up by another good sentence, etc., you're probably a pretty good writer. So we're going to explore all the stuff I learned when I was teaching freshman comp, the ways to screw up a sentence. And that number is really small. And then it turns out that the practice, the study and the practice of law also create some problems that are peculiar to the law and, oddly enough, to the social sciences. So there are a couple of things you all need to learn about the language we use as lawyers that will help make you a more successful writer. And that's going to be, we're going to take a break in about 45 minutes, about halfway through the morning. We're going to talk about your samples, probably until about 3 o'clock this afternoon. And trust me, it won't be nearly as dreary as it sounds. And then for the last hour, we're going to have some fun. I'm going to break you into pairs, and we're going to work on editing some genuinely poor sentences. Okay, so in your materials, please find this page, which ought to be page number 1. And this is a drafting exercise I'm going to ask you to do. There's no trick to it. There's no surprise ending, no nothing. It is, at least I mean it to be very straightforward, and I think that it is. The problem, and even I can't read off that screen, you represented the plaintiff at trial. You produced an expert, but the trial judge rejected the expert's credentials. So the expert, your expert, didn't testify. Your client, the plaintiff, loses the trial, and you appeal that decision. And you have to write the appellant's brief, an appellate brief, okay? Any questions about the problem? I mean this to be a really clean and narrow drafting exercise. Okay, your task is to write the first, what I hope would be the first sentence of the argument portion of your appellate brief. It's kind of an issue statement. However you want to label this, we don't even need to get real picky about that. That sentence has to do 2 things. Number 1, the sentence should describe for your reader what the motion, or I'm sorry, what the appeal is about it. I grabbed the wrong. And secondly, tell the reader in that sentence explicitly who's bringing this appeal. Okay? Questions about this? Now, before you start to write, here's the tricky part. I will allow you to use only these words for a couple of reasons. Number one, if everybody used their own vocabulary, it would be difficult to compare one sentence to the other because somebody's calling it this and somebody else is calling it that. The more important thing about this exercise, this is not an exercise in writing the swellest imaginable sentence. This is an exercise in seeing just how familiar each of you is with the various sentence structures that English allows you. Okay? So, any questions? Get to work. Who has not yet got 3 words written? Has everybody got 3 words on the page? I'll take that as a yes. Stop. All right? You don't have to go any further because with the first 3 words, you've already committed to some sentence structure. I haven't given you enough words to do a lot of throat clearing. So you have committed to a sentence structure. Now, what I want you to do is the same task. You're stuck with the same bunch of words, but to write a differently constructed sentence. That is, adopt a different sentence structure. And if it helps, if your first sentence was active, make your second sentence passive. But even before you do that, let me take a little poll. Raise your hand if any drudge like myself has ever told you, use the active voice, avoid the passive voice, all right? Keep your hand in the air if you are even 90% certain you can define the active voice and the passive voice. Okay, so very few people, and I don't doubt that you can, but it turns out most people really don't exactly know why. Well, that's what today is. By noon, you will know the difference, and the difference could not be simpler. So in any case, take a shot at rewriting the sentence in a different style, whatever you want, voice, than you wrote your first sentence in. You can use different words out of the box than you would have used the first time around. And you're not going to like this sentence over much because it's your second best choice with words you're stuck with. Who does not have 3 words down on this sentence? Looks like everybody does. Stop, because once again, you've committed to a structure. Now, if I were feeling particularly sadistic, I would ask you to try it a 3rd time. However, many of you are bigger than I am, so I'm not going to do that. Very, very few people can come up with a third way. So, somebody, or all of you, yell out, boy, you know, the Zoom function on this is one person and 3 people. I don't know which to press. I guess I want just the one. No, I want the 3. Okay, yell out the first word of your first sentence. Okay, I heard. That's okay for appellant, right? What's the next word in that sentence? Everybody? Contents. Great. Don't write these down because I'm going to give you all of these fleshed out in a little while. Now, with that sentence, that particular construct, did anybody have a different first word for that sentence? The. How many used the? Wow. A majority. How many didn't? Well, this is a pleasant surprise to a conservative grammarian like myself. We'll talk more about that. Somebody give me the first word in a differently constructed sentence. The, go on. All right, let's go with court. The court. I don't think, you can't use trial, that'll cost you $5 right there. Okay, and you know, and there's nothing wrong with that sentence, but it doesn't exactly, and I'm predicting where it would go, but it's the court erred when it rejected the, by rejecting the appellant's expert or credentials somehow. Okay, and there's nothing on earth wrong with that sentence. But I asked you to explicitly tell the reader who's bringing this. And that sentence doesn't quite do it explicitly, right? And imagine, the sentence is, the court erred when it rejected the appellant's expert's credentials, right? Okay. Notice that in order to figure out who's making this claim, the reader has to draw an inference. That is, well, I guess if it's the appellant's expert, it must be the appellant bringing the issue, okay? And, again, I'm not being at all critical, but I do want to suggest, don't leave inferences to be drawn. And that's for 2 reasons. Number one, sometimes you'll guess wrong, and the reader may draw an inference you didn't intend. But there you are, yes. But you know what happens when we assume, now don't you? But the other reason not to make your reader draw inferences, even a little one like this, is it's more work for your reader who doesn't want to be there in the first place. If you can get that notion through your head, that the easier I can make this for my reader, the happier my reader's gonna be. Did anybody start with the word it? Any others that we want to go into? Well, I'll tell you what. I'm going to give you the possibilities that I had intended. And once again, the sentence that came from over here is perfectly fine. And I'll tell you the truth, when I put this problem together almost 25 years ago when I started teaching at the college, and I was convinced that out of that little box full of words, there were only 4 sentences that could possibly be generated. And every time I teach this particular segment, I get surprised because someone will have come up with a variant that I hadn't anticipated, which reminds me of a story about a college physics professor who wanted his final exam to be easy to grade. So he came up with a problem that he was convinced not only had one correct answer, but he was convinced that there was only one conceivable way of getting the right answer. And he ended up getting surprised, just as I'm getting surprised, because I thought that there's only 4 sentences and there are 50. But here's the problem, and see if you can figure this out. You need to determine the height of a farmer's barn, and you are armed only with a very precise barometer. How do you do it? Well, the scheme that the professor had in mind was you would go to the bottom of the barn, take the barometric pressure, climb to the top of the barn, take the barometric pressure, and with a sufficiently precise barometer and the magic of physics, you can determine how tall the farmer's barn is. And most everybody who got the answer right got it on that basis. But one person, 2 people had ends around, one of which bordered on the brilliant. Here's the not so brilliant one. One student said, I would climb to the top of the barn with the barometer. I would drop the barometer from the top of the barn, and knowing the speed, I would time its fall to the earth, knowing the speed of a falling object, blah, blah, blah. The brilliant answer was, so one kid wrote, I would go to the farmer, and I would say, if you tell me how tall your barn is, I will give you this really precise barometer. Okay, so before we talk about anything, first of all, if this was your first sentence, and it usually is people's first sentence, your instincts are good. And the question is, does the belong here or not? And my short answer, although I'm going to give you a longer one, my short answer is yeah, it still does. But I'll tell you, I mean, I've been teaching writing for 40-some years and teaching legal writing for 30 years. When I first started teaching legal writing, the answer was unequivocally yes. You have to have the there. Today, it's really on the fence. We are at a point in the development of English, and languages constantly mutate. You can't stop them from mutating. We are at that point in English that the here kind of gets optional. And if my hunches are correct, in 30 years, whoever's sitting in these seats 30 years from today, nobody will have used the. Now, what this the is, it's an article. English has 3 articles, the, and a. Okay? Now, 30 years ago, the was mandatory because it was pretty plain that formal writing and your legal documents, legal briefs, judicial opinions are formal documents. And one of the markers of formal documents was the thorough use of the articles. That seems to be going away only because fewer lawyers and judges are using them. That there's some movement away from these. Now, one of the other formal markers of a formal writing style was the absence of contractions. All right? And I think we all learned in law school, you can't use isn't, didn't, wouldn't, don't in your briefs, unless you're quoting somebody. I'll tell you, that's just beginning to crumble. I'm just beginning to see and it seems to be starting in administrative agency opinions, and I don't know why that's, and I don't even have enough to give you a statistically sound answer. But sooner or later, that marker of formal style will probably erode. But for the moment, hang on to it. Now, let me argue, so one reason to include it is that 30 years ago, it was absolutely a marker of a formal style, the article. Today, not so much. But let me show you a couple of reasons why it's probably still good, it still makes good sense to do so. It appears as if one of the first cultural evidence of the disappearance of the articles came from journalism. Headlines don't use articles, all right? Why, class, why don't headlines use articles? Space, right, it's space, pure and simple. Let me show you a headline, or it's really a subhead, from the Milwaukee Journal from many years ago. This would be, I'll give you a moment to chew on it. Anyone have any questions like, what the hell does that mean? Northside mental health site, only one county has continued running. Okay. Well, the problem becomes that sometimes if you leave out too many of these markers, you lose, you lose clarity, God knows. Let me plug in two thes into this sentence. Okay? And now, it doesn't make it Shakespeare, but it makes it intelligible. Okay. Anybody here named Pat? You want to volunteer? Of course you do. Pat, you are going to be my employee for the next 90 seconds. And unfortunately, this slide was not designed with this particular thing in mind, but let me blow this up as much as I can. This shows you what an old fart I am. This is a telegram. You are my employee, and I send you that telegram. First of all, can you read it? Yeah, okay. Pat, what have I told you? The ship sails tomorrow. Okay. Now, I'm going to go over here for a minute because I don't want Pat to hear this. But the fact is, Pat has never been much of an employee. And frequently, he forgets what line of work we are in. My company manufactures sails for ships. Okay? So what have I told Pat to do? Ship the sails tomorrow. And what is Pat doing? He's sitting at the dock of the bay watching the ships come in. And thank you for being the goat on this. The fact of the matter is, those three words, ship sails tomorrow, as they stand, are intrinsically ambiguous. You can stare at them, you can argue about them, but you cannot divine the drafter's intent from them. And most people, Pat among them, most people's first assessment of what's going on with those three words is to assume that this is subject and verb. A ship sails, okay? And the reason is the subject first and verb next is the way that 99% of our sentences get drafted. But the fact is that ship can either be a subject or a verb, and sales can either be a verb or a noun. Now, if I put the at the beginning of the sentence, there's no more ambiguity, right? We have Pat's meaning and Pat's meaning alone. However, if the goes here, we have my meaning and my meaning alone. The point of this is that the articles in English mark nouns. Okay? The articles tell you, the reader, that the next important word is going to be a noun. There might be an intervening adjective or two, the big red, 12 big red apples, but the next important thing is going to be a noun and not a verb. Now, in our sentence, the appellant contends or appellant contends, whether we use the or not. This is not going to lead to any kind of confusion on the reader's part. But we're creatures of habit. And if we get in the habit of omitting articles, someday it may come to bite us in the nose. And let me give you what I think is a pretty powerful example. About 10 years ago, give or take, I gave this very lecture at a group of the justices from the Supreme Courts of the whole Pacific Northwest. And it was like a 3-day seminar in some lovely resort. And the woman who spoke after me was a professor from Cornell who had written an interesting book and gave a 3-hour talk on the Bush-Gore election cases. And she began with the problematic voting. Most of you are old enough to remember hanging chads and all of that kind of stuff. Well, she went through all of the problem ballots in the state of Florida. And when she got to one form, as she was talking about it, she said, it's a shame that whoever drafted this form ballot in some counties in Florida, it's a shame they hadn't heard Hofer's talk, because a problem might have been avoided. And here is pretty much what that ballot looked like. And maybe you can see where a problem might arise. What happened was, and a lot of people in the state of Florida made this mistake. They went into the voting booth, and I want to vote for Al Gore. So I do, Al Gore. And it says, write-in candidate. Okay, I will. Anybody who voted that way in the state of Florida didn't vote at all. These ballots were thrown out in their entirety in the less than infinite wisdom of the Florida Election Commission, which, of course, as you remember, was a Republican Party operative. Now, I'm not going to get political here, but the point is that if this ballot had said this, a write-in candidate or the write-in candidate, nobody would have made that mistake, all right? They would have seen this as a third option rather than being a command. So this means that for want of an article, we might have had a different president for 8 years. So I know this looks like tiny stuff, but that's how language operates. Okay, what's coming your way now are the 4 sentences. And while you're waiting impatiently, I'm sure, while you're waiting to get your copy, and once you get your copy, then you can trade them with your friends, just read through these 4 sentences and convince yourself that they mean the same thing, all right, that they contain the same content. Yeah, please, just these 3. Okay, and again, I'm sorry, I apologize for the resolution or lack thereof, but okay, the appellant contends that the court erred when it rejected the credentials of the expert. Second, it is contended by the appellant that error was committed by the court when the credentials of the expert were rejected. Third, the contention of the appellant is that the rejection by the court of the credentials of the expert was error. And finally, it is the contention of the appellant that it was the rejection by the court of the credentials of the expert that was error. Okay, now, first of all, pick your favorite. And I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of argument about which of these is everybody's collective favorite. Let me point out something about, these are really 3.5 different sentence structures because we really only have 3 different kinds of verbs. And the 4th sentence is simply an unhappy variant of sentence number 3. Now here's something that studies of legal briefs and judicial opinions has nailed down beyond question. When lawyers and judges write facts, we use sentence structure number 1. And sometimes sentence structure number 2. And it comes naturally to all of us. And by the end of the day, you'll see why it comes naturally to all of us. So that when lawyers are writing facts, we use predominantly sentence structure 1. Unfortunately, when judges and lawyers move into argument or analysis, we end up going in this direction, sentences 3 and 4. And again, by the end of the day, you'll know why that's true and why it's not a great idea. Okay, I think we've got time to do this. We'll break in about 15 minutes. Let's look at sentence number 1. And what we're going to do for the rest of the day is to figure out, number 1, what do we call these variants? And number 2, what's good and bad about them? So, here is your first class question. And I promise you, your instincts will give you the right answer. Class, what voice is this sentence written in? Everybody. Active voice. And the better question, which I won't ask, is how come? What makes the active voice active? Well, in order to get there, we're going to have to look at sentence structures. And, you know, lawyers and judges are so focused on content. We are so driven by getting all of that material on the page that it becomes very easy to forget how you're organizing it on a sentence structure level. And as you can see, even from the 4 sentences, there are better and worse ways of organizing the same quantum of material. Okay, this is the active voice. Now, background. This sentence has 3 clauses in it. Now, what's a clause? A clause is just a bunch of words that make sense, that contain, at minimum, a subject and a predicate. We're going to call the predicate the verb because that's the essence of the predicate. So, a clause contains a subject and a verb, at least. So the first line is a clause, the second line is its own clause, and the remainder is the third clause, okay? Now, we're going to look at a couple of structural elements of this sentence, structural ways to think about what's going on in the sentence. And the first structural level is one that, even though it won't sound like it, you are completely familiar with. I'm going to call that the syntactic level of this sentence. Well, syntax is the kind of word that strikes terror into most people. Syntax. Well, it turns out syntax is remarkably simple. Every language on the planet, and there are, give or take, 6,000 of them, every language has its own syntax. The syntax of any language is simply that set of rules that govern for generating sentences, right? Every language that I know of, and I don't know of that many, but every language has a completed thought notion, a sentence-like notion. They may not call them sentences. And the syntactic elements that you need to pay attention to are these: subjects, verbs, and objects, which I'm going to abbreviate to SVO. All right? Now, here's a tip if you want to be a better writer starting tomorrow. After class tonight, find a clean-looking tattoo parlor and get a tattoo that says S-V-O. And you are on your way to being a better writer. And what you have just tattooed, and I'm not suggesting your forehead is necessarily the best place for said tattoo. Just, like under your watch band or someplace where it's not going to show, but someplace that you can remind yourself. This, subject first, verb in the middle, object at the end, is the structure of virtually every sentence you write professionally. There are only 3 exceptions to the rule of SVO. The first is poetry. You ain't writing that. And if you are, you have problems beyond any that I can help with. So poetry, yeah, we can monkey with words and put them wherever we please. The second is the question. When we ask a question, we begin with part of the verb. So if I ask you the question, can you give me a sentence where the verb comes before the subject? That's the sentence. Can you give me? Okay? So questions naturally invert the subject and part of the verb. The third example is a particular sentence structure that begins with an adverb of place. And the easiest way to explain it to you is to give you the usual example of it, which is, here comes the judge. If you begin a sentence with an adverb marking place, like here, the subject and the verb reverse, because the core of that sentence is really the judge comes here, okay? Now, we don't use that particular sentence structure all that much, and we don't ask that many questions. So what this means is every sentence you're going to write, and you have written professionally, follows subject, verb, and object. Here's why this is important. 6,000 languages on planet Earth. Every one of them with perhaps one or two exemptions. So virtually every language on Earth has a notion of subject and a notion of verb and a notion of object. Now, all language did not begin from one primal source. Languages occurred at different times in human history and obviously in different places on the planet. Nonetheless, even though they're popping up now and then and here and there, they all, almost all, have a commonality of those three structural units. Linguists, and by the way, not all languages are SVO. But you can find a language for every permutation of those three letters someplace on planet Earth. I'll tell you an interesting story and then we'll take a break. 45 years ago, on the campus of the University of Nevada in Reno, which is where the Judicial College is, a bunch of anthropologists decided to conduct kind of an earth-shattering experiment, and that was, do other species besides Homo sapiens have language? Now, you may be thinking, well, look, Hofer, I got a dog, I tell him to sit, he sits. Language. Well, if your dog tells you to sit, then we're getting someplace. Language has to go in both directions, okay? So these anthropologists, 45 years ago, figured, well, the smartest animal we can think of is the chimpanzee. And so they took what looked like a bright enough female who they named Washoe, after the Washoe Indians, and it's also the county, Washoe County, Nevada, which is where Reno is. So they took Washoe and immediately discovered that you can't teach a chimp to speak because chimp larynxes, excuse me, are not constructed to make language noises, okay? They can make some wild-ass noises, but they won't be language noises, not human noises. So they're stuck, but they figure chimps have very agile fingers. So, class, what do you suppose they decided to try to teach Washoe the chimp? Sign language. It took them years of working with Washoe, but they finally got to the point where Washoe could sign complete sentences. And this is like a breakthrough. There was only, to their eyes, there was only one problem with Washoe's grammar. And that was that Washoe would sign Washoe, banana, want. And they would say, no, Washoe want banana. And Washoe would sign, no, Washoe, banana, what? And chimps can get cranky on you. Well, because these were mere anthropologists, their conclusion was, We've discovered that other species have language, and incidentally, we've discovered the uppermost limit of chimp intelligence, which is to say, chimps are smart enough to have language, they're just not smart enough to get it right. Well, here's the irony. If these experimenters had been linguists, the minute that Washoe signed Washoe banana want, they'd have given Washoe all the bananas they had, because of all the language patterns on this planet, this, Washoe's, is the #1 most popular. English is only #2. So Washoe is brighter than English in some statistical way. And it turns out that there is a language for every permutation of these letters, with one exception. There does not appear to be a language which is object first, subject in the middle, verb at the end. That structure does not appear to exist, except that there is one speaker of OSV language, and as soon as somebody guesses who it is, we'll take our break. Yoda it is, our little green buddy. In 100 years, as good as me, object you, subject shall look not. Okay, take 15 minutes. I've got about 10:30 on the nose. Okay, so we're still on our first sentence, which we've identified as the active voice. And I've urged you to get a tattoo that says subject, verb, object on it. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is to take 15 seconds out and take your own personal best shot at identifying subjects, verbs, and objects, all right? So go to work. Okay, let's give it a shot. Class, what's the subject of the first clause, everybody? I need to hear more voices, or there are going to be service animals involved here. What's the verb? Subject of the second clause. Second clause. Verb? You know, it's funny, when I use this with judges, I've got a room, you know, sometimes I'll have 100 judges in a room, and when they have to say court aired, their voices tremble. Subject of the third clause. It. Verb. And what is credentials? Right. Now, somebody take a shot. What kind of object is it? It's a direct object, and we'll figure out what that means in a bit. And what is expert? Another object, and it's the object of the preposition. This is a prepositional phrase, okay? Now, let me stop and talk about prepositional phrases. Here's a good rule of thumb. The fewer of them you use, the happier your reader will be, okay? So if you can transform objects of the preposition, somehow your reader will be happier. Now let's just take the last, and matter of fact, I shouldn't even use this screen. This screen is finally working. I think the projector on this side sobered up, so things are clearer now. So just take those last 5 words, the credentials of the expert. Class, What's another way of conveying that same information? The expert's credentials. I urge you to use that. And I'll give you one good reason now and another good reason later. The first good reason is it's fewer words. The expert's credentials is only 3 words. The credentials of the expert is 5. Now, I will urge you to do that, and you won't listen to me. And this is true for judges and lawyers. Judges and lawyers are somehow in bed with prepositional phrases that they don't need to use. And I have a theory on why it is it's so hard for judges and lawyers to break the habit of saying the credentials of the expert and say the expert's credentials. Class, in law school, were we allowed to use contractions like isn't, didn't, wasn't? No. Class, how do we mark contractions in English? Class, how do we mark possessives in English? You get my point? I think what happened is originally we were taught there is one form of the apostrophe you can't use. And with the dust of time, we finally kind of come to the broader and more incorrect conclusion, which is apostrophes bad. They're not. Use them in possessives. It is every bit as formal. And you know, here's the funny thing. Every now and then, I'll have either judges or lawyers speak up and say, you know, but the expert's credentials doesn't look as formal. And it'll be because that person hasn't distinguished between the 2 different uses. Okay, so enough about that. Okay, now, none of you has given a lot of thought about sort of diagramming a sentence this way. Nonetheless, if this is within your skill set and within your pay grade as well. And I'm suggesting if you want to be a better writer, you're going to have to keep track of what you're putting where in your sentences. And the short tip is put the content in the subject and the verb in the sentence. Why? Because those are the 2 parts of a sentence in every language. All right? Languages depend upon a subject and a verb to create a completed thought. So when you are communicating heavily in the content of the subject and the content of the verb, you are communicating about as primally as you can linguistically. Okay, so you have now done all of the syntax that needs to be done. However, this only gets us halfway to defining what the active voice is all about. We need to look at a different structure, a structure that you're not accustomed, to thinking about. And we're going to call that the semantic structure of this sentence. Now, anytime I say the word semantics, I turn off the light. And I do this for a symbolic reason that could be appreciated by any of you who has ever tried to study semantics. When I was in grad school, I signed up for a semantics course. I didn't finish the course. I didn't actually start the course, come to think of it, but I bought the textbook. Now, here is the title of the textbook, and this is a very famous work in semantics. The title of the textbook is The Meaning of Meaning. Now, I don't know about you folks, but it has got to be one hell of a sunny day, and I have to use every living brain cell I own, and if I concentrate hard enough, I can intellectually embrace the meaning of the meaning of meaning. I can do this for a good 2¼ seconds, and then it's lost in the clouds. Now, I may not be that bright, but I am no fool. And it dawned on me, and I think rightly, that in all likelihood, there's going to be stuff inside the book even more difficult to understand than the title. So I dropped the course. Okay. However, in the intervening 45 years, I have learned a lot about semantics, and I'm going to give you a definition of semantics that will do you no earthly good until about 90 seconds from now. And here's our working definition of semantics. Semantics is the study of pre-dictionary meaning. Ta-da! Well, it turns out that the best way, come on, light, come back. Oh, jeez. What have I done? Why is this not coming down? Light is on. Okay, it'll start up again. No, that's fine. Okay, turns out the easiest way to get your head around semantics is to do some semantics. So you as a class are going to do a semantic analysis of the following sentence. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. I repeat for those of you on meds. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. Class, who is gyring and gimbling? The toves. Conversely, what are the toves doing? Everybody. What kind of toves are they? And where were they doing this? Bingo. You don't know what the hell any of these words mean, but it doesn't matter because you know what's going on in the sentence at a pre-definitional level. And what you know is who is doing something. You also happen to know what kind of who. That, by the way, is a sentence you don't get to use that often. And where this is happening. But here are the primary semantic elements. It's the who and what the who is doing, which we are going to call actor and action. And that is your second tattoo. Actor hyphen action. If you keep track from this day forward of all the actions you are expressing in a sentence, and we will see that there's a number of ways to express action. If you keep track of the actions you express, and if you also keep track of them so that the reader knows who is doing those actions, your writing will become a great deal better. I've been obviously doing this for a very long time, and I will tell you, and I should be ashamed of this because it should have come to me earlier, and it didn't. It's only within the last 5 or 6 years that I came to a realization about writing. And here it is. The next time you read a sentence that you can't get your head around, all right? Like that sentence I showed you earlier about the injection of the question of negligence or whatever. a sentence that you can't understand. The reason will be very simple. The reason that you won't be able to understand something is that you won't know who is doing what. In legal writing, we learned we express the doing part, the action part, in a variety of ways, and we're going to look at them. But we often forget to tell the reader who is doing the actions, okay? So, your second tattoo, actor and action, those are the semantic elements, and now take 20 seconds out, look at our sentence, and figure out actors and actions. Okay, let's give it a try, class. What's the actor in the first clause? I'm not hearing enough voices. Would you all do me a favor and turn off your little wireless telegraphy devices? Because it's very off-putting if you're standing up here watching people play with computers, okay? Okay, actor. What is the action? Thank you. Actor in the second clause. What's the court doing? Yeah, I know, it's tough for judges to phase two. Third clause, actor. And what's it doing? Got it. And what is credentials semantically? If you can dredge up from your memory the definition for a direct object that you were undoubtedly taught in grade school, you will have its semantic value. Anybody remember the definition of a direct object? It is the thing acted upon. All right? So when you were taught that a direct object is a thing acted upon, even in the third grade, you were getting an early dose of both syntax and semantics. So in this clause, the actor does this action of rejecting, and what is it rejecting? The credentials, the thing acted upon. Okay? Now, it turns out there is enough information on this page to define the active voice. You just have to know where to look. There are two conditions that must be met for a verb or a clause to be active, okay? The first condition is right on the page, and that condition is that the verb expresses what, class? Action. The verb expresses action. The verb expresses action. Now, this should come as no great surprise to anybody because that's what verbs do in any language. They express action. The newest edition of the Oxford English Dictionary tells us that there are about 1 million words in English. My guess is at least 150,000 of those have to be verbs. And every last verb, except one, expresses action. And some of that action is physical, some of it is intellectual, some of it is emotional. but verbs express action. So condition one of the active voice is verbs do the action. What's the second condition of the active voice? It's right on the page. The second condition is, in the active voice, the subject is what, class? The actor. All right? That's all there is to the active voice. There's nothing more complicated. It is that simple, but it requires you to think in two different structural modes at once. A syntactic mode that gives you subjects and verbs, and a semantic mode that gives you actors and actions. And notice the economy of the active voice. The subject and the verb are the most important syntactic elements in a sentence. The actor and the action are the most important semantic elements in a sentence. And notice the economy in the active voice, that both the important syntactic elements and the most important semantic elements are expressed in only two words. Okay? Now, so just so you got it clear, in the active voice, the verb expresses action, and the subject is the actor of the verb's action. I'm not going to say much about the active voice. I could go back to Strunk and White, who says, use the active voice. And it should be our default setting. It isn't when we move into argument or analysis. It should be, and it still can be, but it turns out that we end up going goofy when we start doing that kind of analysis. So in any case, I'm just going to suggest that you use the active voice unless you have a reason not to use it. And there's all kinds of reasons not to use it, and we're going to run into some. Now, the two advantages of the active voice, one of them is, one you can tell without even counting the words on the page. The active voice is going to be the most economical way of getting your point across. It will take the fewest words. And what do we know about your audience already? Your audience doesn't want to be there. So the fewer words I have to wrestle with, the happier I'm going to be. So that's one advantage of the active voice. The second advantage of the active voice is that it tends to keep the subject, the verb, and the direct object, if there is one, closely bunched together in the sentence. Because when we talk about sentences being subject, verb, object, that object is far more often than not a direct object, the thing being acted upon. However, if you work at it, you too can screw up the active voice just royally. And let me give you an example. 25 years ago, the college sent me to work with an administrative agency in the state of Washington. It was their Bureau of Industrial Insurance Appeals. And these folks were nice enough or foolish enough to send me their book of regulations in advance. Now, for a grammarian, a book of agency regulations is a candy store of bad writing. And let me show you, and actually last year I went back to work with this same group. And I will tell you that this regulation isn't in the books anymore, and for a good reason. I'll give you a moment to kind of work with that to the extent that it can be worked with. It's one sentence, and it is overall an active sentence. It is at its core an active sentence. Now, again, anybody want to stand up and say, that one's mine? Okay, we can all agree, this is awful writing. Well, how can we figure out why we don't like it? Well, one way would be to look at the basic syntax involved. Now, you all have the tattoo that says SVO. What that also means is that unless there's some kind of prefatory phrase in a sentence, the first thing you run into in a sentence that could be the subject, pretty much gonna be the subject, all right? That means subjects come at the very beginning of sentences in legal writing. So, class, what is the putative subject of this sentence? Yeah, a provider, health service provider. We don't need to put too fine a point on it. So, and it turns out that this is a compound subject. It's a disjunctive, but it's still a compound subject. Okay? That is the subject. What is the main verb for that subject? File, that's part of it. Must file. Okay? All right. We are to this point in the sentence. Knowing what you know about this writer's, I use this word in a pretty broad sense, writing style, I will tell you that there is a direct object. Where might it be found? It is notice of appeal, all right? Now you know why you don't like this sentence. Rule of thumb, you can't put too much crap between the subject and the verb and the direct object, or your reader will get lost. Our brains are sort of where our computers were, and I don't know how long ago, 8, 10 years. There was a brief window when, remember, no one could buy enough RAM. It simply wasn't available. Now we've got RAM up the ass, but back then you couldn't get RAM. Well, that's where our heads are stuck. We ain't got RAM. RAM is that in-the-moment processing ability. And the act of reading is an in-the-moment process of intellect. Let me try to recreate for you my mental process as I went through this sentence the first time I read it. I start off, a health service provider or other person, I figure, got me a subject. And I keep reading and reading the departmental decision. At about this point, I say to myself, was I supposed to bring something home from work? I think my wife told, bread. We needed bread because last week we had some really nice, that sort of a crunchy French bread, maybe they find. I'm not really sure, and I wonder if they've got that at the Quickie Mart, because I am down to fumes and I got to stop and boom! I am now roused from my dogmatic slumber when I get to the verb. And I ask you, am I thinking about health service providers? No, I've lost interest a long time ago. I'm trying to figure out whether the Quickie Mart sells French bread. We haven't the mental power to store this away and nonetheless process all of these contingencies. Now, who wrote this sentence? A lawyer? I beg to differ. It takes a roomful. Okay? This is committee written. And let me see if I can prove it. We are the committee that has to write the regs for this agency, and we've been doing it all week, and it's 10 to 5 on Friday afternoon, and I'm the chair, and I say, look, guys, we got 10 minutes left. Let's do something easy. Let's do the notice of appeal provision. And this gentleman over here says, well, Ron, it's pretty simple. A health service provider must file a notice of appeal, TGIF. And then this person over here, this woman over here says, no, wait a minute. It could be anybody who's aggrieved by a department order, couldn't it? And this fellow over here says, or by a decision-making demand for that matter. Well, do you see how this sentence got written? My point is it had to start with that guy or somebody who looks just like him. This had to start with that core, and all the rest of this sentence is just laden with conditions and options and restrictions and all of these things. And there is something, in my opinion, in the nature of those who write regulations who seem to believe that once you put the period down, the law has to end there. So that we're trying to get all this crap in a sentence. And this is well more than one sentence's worth of crap to communicate. The only thing you can do with a sentence this badly written is, I think, to take it out behind the barn, put a bullet in its head, and tell the kids it ran away, you know? Okay. We move on to, before we move on to sentence number 2, let's do another little piece of review, and this is, what are the 7 or 8 parts of speech in English? Somebody throw out 1 or 2 to start. Nouns, verbs, adjective, adverb, I'm sorry? Articles, yeah. Articles is usually the number 8 one. Prepositions, pronouns. Yeah, that could be a number 8 too, but there's one more prominent than interjection. Conjunctions. Okay? Now, I'm dividing these parts of speech into 2 different groups because linguists do. And it turns out there is a fundamental difference between these parts of speech in a language and these parts of speech in a language. These are called meaning words because they communicate the bulk of the meaning in a sentence. The rest of these guys are called function words because what they do is to explain to the reader or the listener how the meaning words interact. Let me give you an example. Function words are really far more sophisticated. They're kind of a meta language as opposed to the plain language of nouns and verbs. You know, we can talk about duckies and bunnies. But when we get into the land of conjunctions or pronouns, for example, take the conjunction and. If I say, John and Mary went to the store, I am saying something very sophisticated as far as value statements. I am saying, of the 2 value statements, John went to the store, Mary went to the store. They're both true. If I said John or Mary went to the store, 2 value statements, one and only one is true, and we don't know which. Now, another interesting distinction between them. Somebody gives me a noun that, as far as you're concerned, didn't exist in English, let's say 40 years ago. So anything computer-related is going to work. Email, all right? Email. Somebody give me a verb. Google is perfect. If I went up to you 40 years ago and said, I'm going to Google you, the police will get involved in a hurry here, okay? And adjectives, they come and go, although not as frequently. A couple of my least favorite words, proactive, so ready active, what do you want? Or value added, and an adverb like proactively. Now, somebody give me a conjunction that didn't exist 40 years ago. Make it 100 years, or 200, or 500, or 800 years. Here's the funny thing about language. Most languages, and English is certainly among them, most languages never get new function words. What happens is we lose some of the function words that we have. We used to have a whole bunch more of prepositions than we have. Let me give you an example. There is a preposition that exists in language, in English, in only one fossilized form. That means with this structure it exists. Beyond that, we never use it. And what it is the directional opposite of the preposition to. Directional opposite of to is one. Fro. He went to and fro about this. Now, once upon a time, you could say, I am going to this table, I am going fro this table. But we've lost fro except in that fossil. Languages don't let new, English certainly, doesn't let new function words in. English has wanted a particular function word for the last 40 years, American English certainly. We need a pronoun that we haven't got. And what is that pronoun? Exactly, a he or she, a third person singular, gender neutral pronoun. Because if you're as old as I am, when I was a kid, it was perfectly culturally acceptable to say, everyone must do his duty. That is, the masculine was the collective. It's not culturally acceptable anymore, so you are wise not to do that. If you want to keep it at that level, you must say, everyone must do his or her duty. The easiest solution to gender-neutral problems is make it plural, because we have a perfectly good gender-neutral plural, which is they or them. Okay? Now, here's an interesting note. In the early 70s, the New York Times, which at the time was, and despite what critics say about it, is still today, an unimpeachable language moderator. In the early 70s, the Times started to use this. Okay? S/HE. And this experiment in generating a new pronoun, the experiment lasted fewer than 6 months because the Times was deluged with phone calls and postcards. Remember them when we didn't have our little wireless telegraphy machines? Everybody contacted the Times saying, get that monstrosity out of the paper of record. And so the Times gave up. And there was an immediate outcry from the then nascent women's movement. And the women's movement said, New York Times, you're a bunch of male chauvinist pigs. Remember that one? If you're old enough. Because you don't have the guts to use this. The fact of the matter is, people's rejection of this has nothing whatsoever to do with sexism. It is purely linguistic. It is simply the fact that we don't allow new function words. The closest that's ever come, and it's still lurking on the fringe, is that. You are wise not to use that. I don't have a slide for it, but somebody used that in a brief in a Wisconsin Supreme Court case back in the mid-50s. And the author of the opinion ripped this guy in half because when he got to, using this in a contract, and the sentence began, and or that Janus-faced monstrosity, and it got worse from there. So you're wise to avoid it. Now, back in the 70s, somebody said, well, we've got the masculine and the feminine. Why don't we include the neutral as well? I think it was a linguist from Texas who came up with it, but okay. All right. Little cheat sheet here, summary. Okay, so the active voice. Efficient, straightforward, and notice the economy of it, that it only takes 2 words to express the important elements of both syntax and semantics. The verb expresses action, the subject is the actor. And this should be your default structure, okay? Any questions about the active voice? Good. Sentence number 2. We will be going through these sentences faster than we have, I promise. It is contended by the appellant that error was committed by the court when the credentials of the expert were rejected. Class, what voice is this sentence written in? And you know it. Say it. Passive. Yeah, it's a passive voice. And what makes the passive passive? Well, to find that out, we have to go back and do syntax and semantics. So I'm going to want you to first do the subjects, verbs, objects, but before you start, I want to warn you. In a group of 25, 2 or 3 of you are liable to make a mistake on identifying subjects and verbs unless you bear in mind what I am about to say. Subjects come first. The first thing that could be a subject will be the subject, okay? Now go through and identify subjects, verbs, and objects. Okay, let's give it a shot. Let me point out that this sentence, like the active, also has 3 clauses. Here's the first clause, here's the second clause, there's the third. So, class, what's the subject of the first clause? Everybody. Got it. Verb is contended, okay? The verb has 2 parts. It has a main verb, and then it has this, which depends on when you went to school. You may have learned that as an auxiliary verb. You may have learned it as a helping verb. You may have learned it as a modal. Whichever you learned it, you learned it. Raise your hand if you had to memorize the helping or auxiliary verbs in grade school. Can anybody still do them? Why the hell they made us memorize these, I don't know. But that's exactly the order that I had memorized it as well. Yeah, okay, so here we have this helping verb. And class, what is appellant? And what kind of an object? Prepositional. Yeah, I said we're not going to pay much attention to prepositional phrases. But you'll notice in the passive voice, if you have a prepositional phrase, it will frequently be what's called an agentive prepositional phrase, meaning it starts with the word by. Okay, what is the class? What's the subject of the second clause? Verb was committed, and court, same thing, object of a preposition. Subject, object of a preposition, verb, okay? Now, once again, you can do this. What's more important, however, is figuring out actors and actions. So go through, stare at this, and figure out who's doing what. Okay, class, what's the actor in the first clause? Appellant, yeah. And what's the appellant doing? Contending. What is the actor in the second clause? Right, and what's the court doing? Committing. What is the action in the third clause? Action. Rejecting. What is the actor in the third clause? It's the court. But notice, it ain't in the sentence. This is one of those inferences that the reader has to draw for him or herself. And you don't want the reader to have to do that. So notice that this sentence doesn't contain as much information as our active sentence did. For this to do that, we would have to add this additional prepositional phrase by the court to get to the actor. Okay? Now, we've now got enough information on the page to define the passive voice. And the passive voice, like the active voice, has two conditions that got to be met. And the first condition of the passive voice is the same as the first condition of the active voice, which is the verb expresses what, class? Thank you. Verb expresses action, verb expresses action. So that's the active and passive voices share that. Why? Because that's what verbs do. But what's the difference between the active and the passive voice? In the passive voice, the subject is not the actor. The subject is not the actor. The subject is not the actor. That's all there is to the passive voice. So the difference between active and passive is just moronically simple. In the active voice, the subject of the sentence is the actor of the verb's actions. In the passive voice, it's not. All right? That's all there is to it. It's really that simple. And let me suggest to you a really quick and dirty test for figuring out whether any sentence plunked down in front of you is active or passive, okay? The test is this. Number one, find the verb. So here I find the verb, okay? Step two, find the actor. If the actor comes after the verb, it's passive. If the actor can't be found in the sentence, it's passive. If the actor comes before the verb, it's active. That rule will get you through 99.831% of the sentences in English. If the actor comes before the action, it's active. Otherwise, it's not. Okay, so now let's talk about the passive voice, and why is the passive voice so routinely dumped upon? Well, for one thing, it takes more words. And notice that if we flesh out the passive sentence to include all of that information, adding this additional by the court, we crank this up to 24 words. Okay, let's get to your life. You have a meeting with a client tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. And that meeting necessitates that you read 2 documents. One document is 15 pages long, and the other document is 24 pages long. Okay? Now, let's be honest, you don't want to read either document, do ye? But of those 2 documents, there's one you will mind reading a little bit less. Which is which? The shorter one. And notice the difference in length between active and passive is substantial. It's not like 2 words. And, our sentences in legal writing tend to be complicated by the fact that there will be multiple actors and actions occurring within one sentence, because that's the complexity that is the law. So, the difference between 15 words and 24 words is a substantial one and not just a de minimis one. Let me give you a better reason, however, for avoiding the passive voice on a regular basis. And this is purely linguistic. What I've done is to take the parallel clauses from the active voice and the passive voice. The court erred or error was committed by the court. And notice, just on a clause-by-clause basis, 3 words, 6 words. Okay? But here's the important part. By looking at your first tattoo, you know that the ordering system in English sentences, unless it's a question, is going to be this. All right? And also notice, we read from left to right. Newsflash. Now, let's play with that for a moment. Are there languages that don't read from left to right? There are. They are Hebrew, Arabic, Chinese, yeah, there's a bunch. Let me tell you an interesting fact that will do you no earthly good until you're at your next cocktail party where you're making small talk. Because sociologists have studied how strangers interact with one another. And that is the first topic that strangers forced by circumstance to chat with one another. The first topic is almost invariably the weather. Why? Because everybody has some. So we chat about, and then the next topic is usually sports. the sports team from my area is superior to the sports team from your area. Discuss, and we do. And then, as most of you know from your own experience, the next topic is almost always ancient languages. So this will come in handy, that pre-classical Greek from before the time of Homer, read from left to right on the first line, and right to left on the second, and left to right, and right to left, and left to right. This style of writing is known as boustrophodonic writing, which pretty much means as the ox plows. And what this means is that the letters in the alternate line, the words are spelled backwards, all right? And the characters themselves are mirror images. So a sigma looks like this on one line, and on the next line looks like this. I think this is why the Greeks are not the world power they used to be, but there's one other interesting thing about reading from left to right. About a little more than 10 years ago now, I had a pretty unique opportunity to spend 3 weeks with the Supreme Court of Afghanistan. And it was sort of an international faculty, and it was an attempt to try and get the Afghan legal system out of the ashes. And I frankly don't think we did much good, but we tried. And I heard an interesting story from one of the other faculty members who had put this program together. And he had served as the rule of law officer in Kabul shortly after we invaded. And he said that the first task that the Army gave him was to try to convince nursing mothers not to nurse their children, but to feed them formula instead. The reason being that Afghanistan is wildly malnourished, and of course, if mom is malnourished, the baby will be malnourished. So this was, the Army had its heart in the right place. In any event, the problem that the Army faced was that Afghanistan is also very, very illiterate. So you can't write this down in a little folder. So what the Army figured was, we'll use a cartoon. So they put together a cartoon that looks rather like this. And what you have is a crying baby, and then you give it formula, and now you've got a happy baby. So the Army prints up a zillion of these and papers Afghanistan with them. The result, now no woman in Afghanistan will give formula to her baby. Even the ones that had been using formula now stop. And the Army is baffled until they bothered to ask one of the mothers, why did you stop? She said, are you crazy? You take a perfectly happy baby, you give him this formula of yours, he starts to cry. That may say more about our foreign policy than anything else I can think of. Okay, going back to this for a moment. So we read from left to right. And we know that the syntax in English is like this, which means the syntax, this syntactic level in both the active and the passive sentences is going left to right, okay? And that's because this rule pretty much trumps everything in language. Now we have to talk about what's the directionality of the semantic level. Who'd have thunk 2.5 hours ago that we would be thinking about the directionality of the semantic level? And what I mean is, what comes first? Well, when I showed you the slidey toves, my first question was, who is gyring and gimbling, right? Somebody give me the informal term for a murder mystery in America. It's a whodunit, all right? There's a reason that we call them whodunits and not by whom was it done's, and that is the directionality of semantics is actor does something to something else. And now, this is a graphic representation of another advantage of the active voice. Sometimes instead of, going through this, I'll just ask somebody, define the active voice. And somebody in the crowd usually can nail it right down. But if you couldn't, you end up saying something like, well, the active voice is like the direct way. And this is almost a graphic of that. We read from left to right, so the meaning level is carried out as our eyes are moving left to right. The syntax in the active voice is revealed in the same direction, as is the semantics. It's almost as though this is like a super highway, and all three lanes, all the traffic is moving smoothly. Let's look, however, at the semantics of the passive sentence. Which way is the semantics going in the passive sentence? The other way. This is known linguistically as ass backwards. This is just ass backwards. And now you can see that the directness of the active voice is not duplicated in the passive voice. It now, all of a sudden, something's going in the wrong direction. Reminds me, back when I worked for the courts and would have to drive home on I-94. In Wisconsin, I was driving home and my wife called and said, be careful coming home tonight. I just heard on the news that there's some idiot going in the wrong direction on I-94. And I said, some idiot? God, there's hundreds of them. Thank you. The better reason for not using the passive voice is it's harder to process. If the syntax is going in one direction and the semantics is going in the wrong direction, it is harder on your reader's brain. And remember, your reader doesn't want to be there in the first instance. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, look, I agree this is more words, error was committed by the court, but I don't really have a sense of how that's harder on my brain to understand. Well, that's the beauty of semantics. Remember, semantics is pre-dictionary meaning, which means we can talk about semantics without knowing the meaning of the sentence. And now, if we just look at the semantic level, what is the first thing in a passive sentence that the reader is told? Reader, here's the thing acted upon. Well, what's the problem with that being the first thing you tell the reader? As far as content goes, here's the result. The result of what? How did this get here? Who did something to produce this? So the passive, and I will show you a sentence in a little while that will prove to you that passives are tougher to plow through. Okay, so this is the better reason not to use the passive voice routinely, because passives are tougher on the human brain. Your reader has to work hard. Now, let's talk about some passives. Here we go. Here is a formulation of the hearsay rule. Now, is there any among you who would like to stand up and just do 2-3 minutes explaining the hearsay rule to your peers? Anybody? I can sweeten this up. I got $9. Right? I have actually used this example in judicial conferences, and I'll be the afternoon, and the morning was spent on hearsay. And I can't get a volunteer. Now, why is the hearsay rule just such a toxic sentence? Well, it's because it's all passive. Hearsay is defined as an out-of-court statement which is offered to prove the truth of the matter which is asserted. And the real problem with the hearsay rule is we don't know who's doing the actions. I should have said earlier, the reason I want you to get a tattoo that says actor action, it's even more important than remembering subject, verb, object. Actor action is more important for this reason. If you write a sentence that doesn't have an actor in it, you are 3/4 of the way to writing what linguists would call a shitty sentence. All right? Wow, that sentence just sucks. Well, let's look at the hearsay rule. Hearsay is defined by who? I don't know. Neither do you. But hell, I'll give you that one. You know, we've all been lawyers long enough to know if it hangs around long enough in the law, it just is. But the next question gets gooder. It's an out-of-court statement which is offered by whom? Beats me. To prove the truth of the matter which is asserted. By whom? Don't know that one either. Is the offerer the asserter? Don't know. Can the offerer be the asserter? Must the offerer be the asserter? Must the offerer not be the asserter? Must the asserter not be the... You see, you don't know who's doing what. The hearsay rule is a perfect example of my discovery that if you can't get your head around a sentence, if you don't know how it operates, it'll be because you don't know who is doing what to whom. The hearsay rule is a shitty sentence by any standard because nobody knows how to work it. Okay. The passive voice, this is a drawback of the passive voice. The fact that you can get away without telling the reader who the actor is in a passive sentence. And let me go back to our passive sentence itself and just point out that notice that in the passive sentence, here's the actor, okay? And what part of speech, or not what part of speech, but what syntactic part is the actor in a passive sentence? Well, it's the object of a preposition. Now, do the rules of grammar oblige us to include an object of the preposition in every sentence? No. Which means the passive sentence allows you to leave the actor out. And that is both a benefit and a drawback of the passive voice. Let's look at, I picked on the Bush administration. Let's pick on the Clinton administration here for a minute. What voice is this written in? Passive. However, and hell, up until a couple of weeks ago, this could have been the headline. You know, this one goes back to Whitewater, I think. In any case, let's say this is tomorrow's headline. And you pick up the USA Today and you read that headline. What question do you naturally ask of the headline? By whom? Who did it? And what this means is every now and then, if somebody tees it up nice and high for you, you will pay attention to semantics. You will notice when a semantic element is missing. And my advice to you is pay attention to actors all the time and notice which ones you're not told about. If you want to have fun with political speech, although I think we've all had political speech up to here after the last year, but there is nothing more entertaining than reading some political speech and picking out where you needed to know an actor and you really didn't get one. And the fact was, it wasn't Clinton alone. I mean, Bill Sapphire. This is my personal favorite. The Cardinal Egan's letter says, if in hindsight we also discover that mistakes may have been made. All right, His Eminence is not even acknowledging the existence of these mistakes. But if in fact they do exist, he's sure as hell not going to tell you who made them. Okay, my point is that this kind of declaration is failed persuasion. It's failed because we see through it. You know, any sentient life form is going to read that and go, wait a minute, mistakes were made. And actually, you know, George Bush said it near the end of his presidency, and the New York Times, not long after, wrote an article saying, we officially retire mistakes were made today, because no one is fooled by this. Now, can we use the passive voice rather, as a means of persuading our reader? We can indeed. Before I show you the legal example, let me give you one that, again, I took from the airline industry. Actually, this goes back to a now non-existent airline, but that I think might have been centered here in Omaha. Was Midwest Express Omaha? Because it was Milwaukee as well. Milwaukee's my hometown, and I think Omaha as well was one of its. In any case, if you never flew Midwest Express, you've missed something. The seats were wide, the food was good, and they would bake chocolate chip cookies in mid-flight. It was heaven, but it's gone. In any case, way back when, if you were doing a very short puddle jump by air, Midwest Express had some planes that didn't have toilets on them. And this is what they would stick onto your boarding pass. Your comfort is important to us. Well, I'm feeling warm and fuzzy already. Please be advised your aircraft is not equipped with lavatory facilities. To ensure a pleasant flight, may we suggest you prepare accordingly. And that, boys and girls, is a euphemism, but it's the sentence in the middle I want to focus on. Please be advised your aircraft is not equipped with lavatory facilities. Class, what voice is that? Passive, all right? And there are two passives in it. Please be advised. That's a passive infinitive. It's a passive command, really. Now, in the words of the sentence, if you want to be a more astute reader, do not behave like the sheep that spinmeisters want us to behave as. That is to say, don't draw their inferences. Take them at face value. So in that middle sentence, please be advised, etc., who is giving the advice? Nobody. It would have been, please be advised by us. But here, you're getting it. Now think about that. You're getting advice from an unknown source. How often does that happen? This is kind of, psst, hey, you, wait, let me tell you something. Your aircraft is not equipped with lavatory facilities. Another passive. This is really great writing. This is persuasion at its best. And it's persuasion that is unavailable in the active voice. Because notice that your aircraft is not equipped with laboratory facilities. who didn't equip this airplane with a toilet? Well, the airlines didn't. But are they in that sentence? No. And listen to what the passive voice conveys emotionally when it succeeds, as it succeeds here. Your aircraft is not equipped with lavatory facilities. It's as though this has been true from the beginning of time itself. It could not be other. This is karma. The passive voice really has power, and notice that the active voice wouldn't work as well. Let's translate the middle sentence into the active voice. Please be advised becomes, we advise you that we didn't put a toilet on this plane. And if the sticker on your boarding pass said, we didn't put a toilet on this plane, how are you going to respond? To this question, I believe there are two correct answers, absolutely correct answers. You can come up with them on your own time. My point is, the passive voice, when it works, has its own power. And let me just point out one last thing, and that is that there's an even sneakier bit of persuasion going on in that statement. Okay, now we're just going to take the second half. Your aircraft is not equipped with lavatory facilities. We don't know who didn't do the equipping, right? So let's look at the words of the sentence in a hunt for a suspect. Now, the actor for not equipping or equipping can only be one of two parts of speech. Actors are either going to be nouns or pronouns, okay? That's your actor for you. So let's identify all the nouns and pronouns in that clause. What's the first noun or pronoun in that middle sentence? Anybody? Your is a pronoun. Next. Aircraft's a noun. Next. Lavatory's a noun. And facility's a noun. We now have four suspects in our hunt for who didn't put a toilet on this plane. And of those four suspects, there is only one capable of not putting a toilet on an airplane. And who is it? It's you. This is your own damn fault, people, because it's your aircraft. I mean, as George Carlin-esque as this may sound, this is how we get persuaded. It's just on this almost micro level. Now, there are those among us, oh, by the way, lunch is at 12:15 to 1:15. There are those among us who are obliged to use the passive voice all day long, right? Criminal defense attorneys. The active voice is not going to come out as happily. Yeah. Now, I can't speak for any judges in the state of Nebraska, but I know a hell of a lot of judges back home in Wisconsin who won't be reading a lot more of this brief, okay? I mean, the cat, she is out of the bag. Okay, and actually, we will end maybe a little bit early. I want to give you an example. Do this again. Okay, let me give you an example of here a judicial, but you'll get the point, it's transferable. This is legal writing using the passive voice to persuade. And this comes from a real case that had absolutely tragic facts. A woman lived across the street from a grade school and glances out her front window one morning and sees some prowler in the bushes in front of the grade school. So she calls the principal's office. And the secretary takes a message. But the secretary, although the secretary knows that the principal's got the day off, the secretary takes no initiative on this at all and simply puts the message on the principal's desk because there were no formal procedures for what to do when the principal's got a day off. Those exist now, I'll tell you. But at the time, the secretary is not the swiftest. So in any case, nothing happens about this warning, and some little 5-year-old is abducted by the prowler and murdered on his way home from school. The family sues the school district, the principal, the secretary, the superintendent of schools. You've got a boatload of defendants. And here's where it gets legally funky. Instead of pursuing a straightforward tort claim, the family's lawyer starts off in the wrong direction out of the box and brings this as a Section 1983 civil rights violation. And the problem with doing that right out of the box is that the law was, and I suspect still is, you can't get relief under Section 1983 until you've exhausted all of your common law tort remedies, okay? And this lawyer didn't. The lawyer just went in the wrong direction from the start. Well, what happened at the trial court level? You can pretty much guess. All the defendants moved for a dismissal, saying, look, he wants 1983 relief. The family hasn't exhausted its common law tort remedies. Judge, you've got to dismiss this case. Okay, now given the facts as you know them, well, hey, this is neat. Given the facts as you know them, and put yourself in the trial judge's shoes for a moment, do you want to dismiss this case? But the fact is, and you know it and judges know it too, that there are times when the law simply obliges that you kind of pick your metaphor, hold your nose or swallow hard or whatever. And so the judge finally dismisses the case. The family then brings an appeal. They're entitled to an appeal. And they appeal to the state's court of appeals, which is, as most states' court of appeals are, an error-correcting court. Now, was there any error committed by the trial judge? No. So what does the court of appeals have to do? It has to affirm. Do you think the appellate judges wanted to affirm? I don't think so. I'm quite certain they didn't. But they're stuck. Now, what I'm going to show you is the paragraph from the court's affirmance of the dismissal of the family's claim. This is the dispositive paragraph from that opinion. I'll let you read it first, and then I'll read it out. Yet the only remedy, poor as it may be, afforded under law is money damages. As such, the remedy afforded under state law is no more nor less adequate as recompense for loss than that afforded under Section 1983. The Enrights, the family, have a common law negligence claim, a claim that we herein reinstate. Due process is therefore not denied them. In this entire paragraph, the Court of Appeals appears only once as an actor. What is the action that the Court of Appeals is taking direct credit for doing. Reinstating. Why? It's the only good thing that can come out of this. The court has limited power. The best it can do is to reinstate the family's claim. Virtually all the rest of this paragraph is passives, and it's passives without explicit identification of the actors, which is allowable in the passive voice. The last sentence is the most particular. Due process is not denied them. By whom? By the Court of Appeals. But does the Court of Appeals want to really use its name and denying this family due process in the same sentence? No, you can keep yourself out of it. And you folks can keep your clients out of it. This, whoever wrote this knew what he or she was doing. This is, in my mind, unquestionably an intentional act of using the passive to bury the lead, as they say. All of these affordeds are passives, and then of course this is a passive as well. And as I say, the court only comes out here, and just as a tip, any time that you've got an active sentence, which we have here, we reinstate, okay? If you put an adverb between the subject and the verb in an active sentence, you are pretty much calling the reader's attention to what you're doing. You know, we herein or we indeed reinstate. So this is intentional. However, does this paragraph read easily? And the answer is no, it really doesn't. And you know why it doesn't. And the reason is because it's passive. And because you don't know who the actors are, you have to draw inferences. And most importantly, because in every one of these passive constructions, there are at least 5 of them, syntax and semantics are coming at you, you know, you have to think about it, but that's why this is tough slogging. So let me just sum up the passive voice, and then we'll go to lunch. Passive voice. It's going to be wordier. But the advantage is you can hide the actor. And notice, different from the active voice, where the subject and the verb communicated both actor and action, here it takes more words to do that. That's why the passive voice is going to take more words than the active voice, because in the active voice, the subject and verb are enough to convey all the important stuff. In the passive voice, the subject is really the thing acted upon. The appellant contended what? Some sort of that, the court, etc. Okay, so the passive voice, the verb still expresses action, but the actor and the subject are different. And the test, as I went through before, if the actor comes before the verb, it's active. If the actor comes after the verb, or if you can't find the actor, it's passive. And finally, use the passive voice if the actor is unknown, as in Fred Smith was murdered, or if the actor is unimportant. If you're writing facts and you say, Fred Smith drove the ambulance containing the victim to the hospital, there's no reason for the active voice there, because you don't need to tell the reader that actor unless Fred Smith has an accident. You know, the victim was transported by ambulance to the hospital. Passive is perfectly acceptable there. Or if you choose not to identify the actor for whatever reason, but otherwise you're probably better off avoiding them, and this is the perfect time to go to lunch.